Red, White, and Radical, the podcast, is based on the book Red, White, and Radical, What Organizations Can Learn About Change from the Rise of American Conservatism. You can get it from the publisher Routledge and in Amazon and other online stores.
Welcome to Red, White, and Radical, a podcast that explores how American conservatism has changed the world. I'm Warwick Harnese, and this is episode 4, Networks. There's a long-standing conservative gripe that American democracy has a liberal bias. If you remember back in episode 2, that was the reason that Lewis Powell recommended in his infamous memo that business needed more influence over academia, the media, and government. It worked for the tobacco industry, but the conservative power elite took a more daring approach. They didn't change America by infiltrating the institutions of democracy and taking them over wholesale. Instead, they built their own culture change factory in order to beat the establishment at their own game. It was risky, but conservatives knew something that the establishment hadn't truly understood. America's national values were up for grabs. The counterculture had proved that. And from the outset, the conservative movement was in the business of creating an alternative reality. Back before anyone talked about such things, they understood that this new brand of conservatism was a lifestyle choice. I'm a lifelong punk fan, and I think that the reason punk has lasted as a genre of music and as a lifestyle is because it built its own networks of operation instead of trying to hitch a ride on the mainstream music industry. The ethic of do-it-yourself was always important in punk, and that inspired people around the world to set up their own performance venues, record labels, pressing plants, distribution companies, booking agents, management firms, and media channels. Many of these bedroom operations went on to become successful businesses as the scene flourished. Unlike punk though, conservatism was more than just an alternative lifestyle. Conservatives saw their cause as a battle for the soul of America, and winning that battle would take money, lots and lots and absolutely shitloads of it. The counterculture trademarked the winning combination of sex, drugs and rock and roll to win converts. Conservatives created a timeless combo of their own to remake America. Mass production, money, and insult humor.
Oh, beautiful!
There's a film called 1991, The Year That Punk Broke. The New York Times called it the rock documentary that defined Generation X because it follows Nirvana on tour with bands like Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., and the godfathers of punk, the Ramones. There's a lot of footage of Kurt Cobain just before he was famous. Someone said it was like watching the moment before a car crash, because in 3 short years Cobain's life would go from normal to mental to death by suicide. 1991 was the year that Kurt Cobain made punk mainstream, but it would never have happened were it not for the interlinked networks that thousands of others had built in the decade and a half before Nirvana broke through. The year that modern American conservatism broke was 2009, when the Tea Party movement erupted seemingly from nowhere to frustrate the Obama administration's agenda.
Obama is a socialist.
All of the key nodes in the underground conservative network came together to make the Tea Party a sensation. Grassroots conservative activists self-organized Tea Party chapters in suburbs across the country. Secretive conservative lobby groups hired PR companies to set up fake Tea Party chapters to give logistical support to the grassroots. And conservative media gave tons of free airtime to the movement, promoting their activities to help win new converts. To understand how the Tea Party pulled off a national song and dance that set the stage for Donald Trump's car crash presidency, we have to follow the crumb trail of cash all the way back, once again, to the early 1970s.
Conservatives were wandering around lost in the liberal wilderness, and then Paul Weyrich came to Washington.
That was Phyllis Schlafly, the great grassroots organizer, paying tribute to the man who laid the foundations for the conservative elite's culture change method. As a young press secretary in Washington, D.C., Paul Weyrich sat in on a closed-door meeting of the Civil Rights Coalition in the late 1960s. Slunk down in the back row, he watched members of Congress, policy wonks, esteemed journalists, church leaders, and social justice activists hatch a plan to pass legislation.
Before my eyes, they rolled out a plan. Nixon had just become president, and they had a defector who came and he said, "These are Nixon's plans. He wants to roll back the Civil Rights Bill on housing." Every liberal group imaginable was there at that meeting. And I watched this interplay. I mean, first they got a brand new Republican, Mac Mathias, he was a liberal Republican, to co-sponsor it so it would be bipartisan. Then the ACLU said they would file a lawsuit, not because of any aggrieved party, but in order to control the polemics of the issue. This was something I had never heard before. Carl Rowan was there, and he allowed us how if they would tell him the timing of this thing, he'd get together the editorial board of the Washington Post, and then they could talk to them and get a favorable editorial. They had the Methodist Church there. The question from the Methodist Church was, how much lobbying should be done. There were black groups there. They wanted to have demonstrations, and finally it was agreed that they should have demonstrations in Washington, but not in the rest of the country because there might be a backlash if they had them in the rest of the country and so on. And I sat there and I watched all these people interact with each other, and I said, that's how they do it.
It was astounding. He was seeing firsthand how the federal machinery of liberal bias did its dirty work. Here was evidence of how the mainstream networked their ideas into law because the cozy corridors of power were so reliably stocked with people whose Bible was the liberal consensus. For Weyrich, the solution was obvious. Conservatives should reverse engineer this liberal system. They needed their own policy writing foundations, friendly journalists, grassroots groups and politicians, and coordinating committees that could herd these different cats into seamless alignment with one another. It should work like an assembly line.
I had watched conservatives getting killed on the floor of the United States Senate, and I didn't know how it was done. I mean, I saw it happening, but I didn't know the mechanics. All of a sudden, I was granted the opportunity to see the mechanics. From that day forward, I was insufferable. Wherever I went, I said, we got to do something about this. We got to have our own organizations. We got to have our own meeting, and so on. And nobody wanted to hear it.
The problem for Weyrich was that he was a working class boy at the start of his career. He was close to penniless. But fortune would smile on him in the form of that Lewis Powell memo. Suddenly, dozens of newly politicized tycoons were scrambling to donate their wealth to conservative causes to protect capitalism.
We spent a couple years, what I now realize is talking to all the wrong people in the business community. And finally, one day in the office, a kid who opened the mail sees a letter that says, you may remember me, I was news director at KBTR in Denver. The letter went on to say, I've been hired by Joe Coors to find out where his money should be put to effectively aid the conservative cause. I began to shake I called up this fellow, Jack Wilson, and I said, Jack, you got to come out here. We explained everything to him and the way the other side operated and all of this. And he said, Joe Coors has got to hear this.
Weyrich seized his moment. Joe Coors, heir to the enormous beer fortune, gave him a line of credit. And in quick succession, Weyrich set up the cornerstone institutions of the conservative future. The Heritage Foundation, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, the Council for National Policy. These blandly named organizations heaved into syncopated action. Heritage focused on the creation of conservative policy. Today, it's one of the most influential think tanks in the world and the only one in the top 10 with an overtly ideological bent. ALEC helps conservatives in Congress to turn heritage ideas into legislation. The Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, now called American Opportunity, is dedicated to recruiting and training grassroots activists and politicians who can sell that legislation to the electorate. Perhaps most important of all is the Council for National Policy, a networking forum that helps political doers like Weyrich connect with political donors like Joe Coors. Weyrich and Coors' serendipitous relationship was remarkably productive. Yet there was another partnership that blew even that one out of the water. More ambitious, more highly networked, and involving loads more money. Rich Fink wasn't rich. He was a juvenile troublemaker with a job loading freight trains. But when he busted his back, he decided to go to university, choosing to study economics precisely because he didn't know what economics was. In the lecture hall, Fink became fascinated with the philosophy of libertarianism, the idea that markets would be more efficient and create more value if they were entirely free and anarchic. No regulation, no handouts, no taxes. Libertarian theory started with a couple of Austrian economists who'd fled Nazi Germany. The mass extermination of Jews was only possible because the Nazis controlled the German economy. The Austrian economists argued that the only way to ever prevent this kind of thing happening again was to have a totally free market, where the means of mass production were beyond the reach of a tyrannical state. Fink wanted to preach this gospel in a university program of his own, but like Weyrich before him, he needed cash. So he set up a meeting with Charles Koch, CEO of an oil refining company called Koch Industries. Fink bought an outfit for the occasion. He turned up at Koch HQ in Wichita, Kansas in a spiffing black polyester suit with white piping. He was a grad student with long hair and a beard and looked a bit like a Saturday Night Fever Bee Gee. Koch flicked through the pitch and said he'd give Fink the equivalent of what today would be $500,000 to do it. Stunned, Fink asked Koch, "Why did you take a chance on a hippie in a disco suit?" And Charles deadpanned, "I like polyester. It's petroleum based." With that, one of the most important conservative relationships of the past 50 years was cemented.
When people have the opportunity to discover their unique gifts and apply those gifts to help others, they find meaning in their lives. They become successful. If that's our goal, then we must create a thriving society where everyone can reach their full potential. But the current debates in our country are taking us off target, way off. Our plan is to present a better alternative.
That's Charles Koch, and as you can hear, there's something almost naively idealistic about him. From the get-go, he wasn't just a rich guy out to protect his wealth. In his own weird way, he wanted to change the world. Charles was a thinker who'd written a book about market-based management, a leadership methodology he'd developed about how to get the best out of employees. But Charles was also an introvert, and out there in his C-suite office amidst the cornfields of Kansas, he was about as cut off from America as it was possible to get while still being in the country. Charles prized innovation and an instinct for business, but he'd been born into privilege and was gifted the company he ran. Fink was entrepreneurship personified, a pragmatic hustler with ideological spirit, a sales guy and a doer all in one. In the late 1970s, Koch and Fink set about imitating Weirich's model in the name of laissez-faire economics. They built the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, the Mercatus Center, an academic research hub, and Citizens for a Sound Economy, a grassroots coordination group that was later renamed Americans for Prosperity.
A few days ago, I was presented with a report I'd asked for, a comprehensive audit, if you will, of our economic condition. You won't like it. I didn't like it. But we have to face the truth and then go to work to turn things around. And make no mistake about it, we can turn them around. We invented the assembly line and mass production, but punitive tax policies and excessive and unnecessary regulations, plus government borrowing, have stifled our ability to update plant and equipment. When capital investment is made, it's too often for some unproductive alterations demanded by government to meet various of its regulations.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan sailed into the White House with a promise to limit government spending, cut taxes, and deregulate business. America seemed ready for full-on libertarianism. Yet for all Koch's money and ambition, he and his little league of libertarians were establishment outsiders. They weren't even considered real conservatives. And that was because Reagan's presidency was built on a curious insight. Americans loved the idea of conservatism, but when push came to shove, they preferred government policies that were decidedly liberal. They embraced rhetoric that talked about the evils of big government, but they didn't really want to get rid of federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid, or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or the military-industrial complex. Reagan, the consummate performer, played to the galleries. The libertarians, though, were deadly serious about annihilating the federal government. In fact, they were so earnest about it that back then people talked about them as a far-right fringe group, sort of like the nihilists in The Big Lebowski.
Man, they were nihilists, man.
Huh?
They kept saying they believed in nothing.
Nihilists. Fuck me. I mean, say what you want about the tenets of National Socialism, dude. At least it's an ethos.
Koch and Fink needed a platform that would help the average American connect with libertarianism. And I like to imagine they found it while staring at the face of Benjamin Franklin on a stack of $100 bills. Franklin was the man who said, "Nothing in life is guaranteed except death and taxes." Koch and Fink could do nothing about mortality, but they could build a movement on the idea of abolishing taxes. And Philip Morris and Big Tobacco were waiting in the wings to help them do this. To the soundtrack of punk breaking in the mainstream, in 1992, a PR guy called Gary Oxier pitched a coalition of tobacco and oil companies a brilliant new concept. What if an American tax revolution could be organized under the banner of a modern-day Tea Party? By combining the authenticity of a genuine grassroots movement and the financial muscle of corporate balance sheets, they could create an unstoppable political force that would wipe out taxation in America forever. Tobacco and oil executives salivated at the prospect. Philip Morris had already tested the idea in a 1989 article titled "A Tea Party, Boston Style," written for their smokers' rights rag, Philip Morris magazine. The most famous protest in American history took place on the chilly night of December 16, 1773. Under cover of darkness, a group of American colonists boarded 3 British merchant ships. Hundreds stood and watched from shore. No one spoke. The only sounds were the grunts of men, the splintering of wood, and the splash of heavy objects being dropped over the side as dozens of chests of heavily taxed British tea were tossed overboard. British policies of minority rule, increased government intervention, unfair taxation. Those same issues face us again today, making it necessary to act to protect our rights as citizens of the United States. Fink was super excited. To him, the concept had way more potential than simply a corporate effort to roll back taxes. The Tea Party was about the destiny of the American people. If the libertarians could build a consumer brand around this story, they could refashion the meaning of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to gain support for abstract libertarian policies across the board. Like punk rock before them, it took the libertarians 15 years to break through with the Tea Party. But in 2009, a perfect storm hit. A crashing economy destroyed property prices and pension pots for middle-class Americans. Massive financial bailouts were given to the firms that caused the Great Recession, reinforcing the adage that in America it's socialism for the rich and capitalism for everyone else. And Barack Obama's affordable healthcare bill raised the specter of a tax increase at a time when the average American was financially hurting. The suburbs mutinied, and the libertarians, posing as revolutionary riders in the image of Paul Revere, lavished them with support.
5 years ago, CNBC viewers tuned in during the midst of the financial crisis and ended up hearing what would be known as the rant heard around the world.
This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all? President Obama, are you listening?
Our own Rick Santelli, speaking from the Chicago Mark, did his own Howard Beale, mad as hell and not willing to take it anymore. Rick's heartfelt rant helped launch what we know now as the Tea Party.
We're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. All you capitalists that want to show up to Lake Michigan, I'm going to start organizing.
To build the Tea Party brand, Fink and his libertarians held up 3 distinct narratives that were popular amongst conservatives: American exceptionalism, Christian fundamentalism, and free market prosperity, and said all 3 of these narratives say the same thing. Brave risk-taking is the righteous path to economic freedom and happiness. And a bloated federal government drags the country down by loading it with debt and discouraging innovation. So this Tea Party unites all of us conservatives in a great awakening of God's chosen people to take a stand against a rigged system. At Tea Party rallies, speakers would talk emotionally about how socialism would rob Americans of their rights, fluffing audiences into a frenzy of indignation. Once they were worked up enough, a scruffy libertarian economist would take the stage to outline the dry detail of the policies for which Tea Partiers should vote.
This is not a bailout country. This is not a country where the citizens are going to lay down to see the Constitution circumvented for expediency to address a credit crisis that many believe, including myself, was in many ways caused by the government and how they interacted and forced their will in the mortgage market. There's been a lot of groups that have been unhappy with status quo, but it amazes me how this grassroots movement started, and if you look back, by mothers and grandmothers worried about the future of their kids and their grandkids in a world with debt being printed at will. So I think the Tea Party's philosophy is alive and well. I call it fiscal conservatism.
The libertarian takeover of the Republican Party was crowned in 2010. An obscure lobbying firm called Citizens United brought an intriguing complaint to the Supreme Court. They argued that if Michael Moore could make a brazenly left-wing film like Fahrenheit 9/11, then they should also be able to make highly partisan films. Lesser courts had struck down that argument, saying that movie studios can make political films simply because they're in the business of making films. And like any private limited company, they don't need to disclose where the money needed to make that film came from. The reason lobbying firms can't make political films with donations from anonymous donors is because their intention would so obviously be to influence how people vote. Citizens United argued that this was an infringement of free speech, and the Supreme Court agreed.
What we've seen since 2010 is more and more money going into our political system, most of it anonymous. There are organizations called 501c4s, which are social welfare organizations, which were started initially in order to promote the social welfare. But now what we've seen is political people creating these 501c4s simply to allow donors to anonymously give their money, and then these groups, which have very innocuous sounding names, like the American Future Fund and Crossroads, things you'd have no idea who's really behind any of these organizations. And they're funding nasty political ads, very destructive in our political system, but really we have no idea who's funding all of this.
The impact of the Citizens United decision was immediate. In the 2010 congressional elections, a third of the electorate voted a raft of Tea Party politicians into the House and Senate. Lobbying groups had spent $300 million on those elections, more than in every midterm election combined since 1990. In the wake of Citizens United, 1%ers across the country could write check after check to quietly get their candidates elected. Or could they? The Libertarians took over the Republican Party at the top, but utterly failed to control the wild grassroots. Koch and Fink & Co. bequeathed them the language of the free market, of winning and beating losers and crushing the competition. That was empowering. And that led the Tea Party rank and file on a quest, from the cornfields of Kansas to the Grand Wizard in Trump Tower. There's a curious coda to this story. Just a few years after the libertarian takeover of the Republican Party, Donald Trump and his crew hijacked them. Rich Fink retired, and Charles Koch reluctantly emerged from the shadows to try to correct his image as America's most evil billionaire. Today, he cuts a grandfatherly figure as the sponsor of Stand Together.
In government, Republican versus Democrat. That has increasingly become a false choice. Both parties have fallen into tribal warfare. They're more focused on destroying one another than solving problems. So we're offering a different approach, uniting people, regardless of political party, to advance policies that empower people so we can finally fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence.
Meanwhile, the Tea Party has journeyed down a tarnished gold brick road to New York. It wasn't a tornado that got them there, not literally, but they did have a soundtrack for the trip, and the men that provided it were a force of nature in their own right. Kings of insult humor and laugh out loud propaganda.
Oh, beautiful! I got on the phone. Somebody, I don't know, they said they went to school with Barack Obama at Harvard. And the guy told me that Obama got the lowest grades that any Harvard graduate ever got, and that a bunch of professors gave him B's and C's when he didn't even show up to class. And then he hung up. Now, I said, can you show me any proof of this? No, hung up the phone. It took all of a minute. So I am calling on Barack Obama to release his Harvard transcript.
All of that and more in part 3.